Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for our talk about securing remote workers with Microsoft 365. Taking some time out of your busy day, so it's going to be a fairly brisk 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll have some questions we'll have some time for questions at the end, rather. So if you do have any questions, do feel free to jump in on the Q&A, and we'll try and tackle those for you towards the end. My name's Mark Taylor. I'm the Managing Director at Chorus. Before you all run for the hills, my background is technical, and today's presentation is going to have a definite technical edge to it, hopefully, so of interest with our fingers crossed. So with that said, let's get a quick intro to Chorus. Those of you who don't know us, so we're a Bristol-based Microsoft services organization. We have quite a broad stack of offerings, core stuff you'd expect, so IT support and managed services, obviously relevant today. We've got quite a strong interest and capability in cybersecurity services, both consultancy side and SOC type operations. We also have a Azure practice, your standard productivity suites, and then we have a bit of the business called Solutions, which deals with things like Teams, SharePoint, governance, Dynamics 365, and .NET development. So that's a brief intro to us and who we are. Now on to today's subject, really. So what's the context for today's conversation? It seems fairly obvious, I guess, but I think it's worth a quick check. So we're going to talk about obviously some of the challenge we think we face today from a cybersecurity perspective, some specifics in there around remote workers and what impact that has. And we'll talk a little bit about user expectations as well, because obviously we've got to mix all of these together and make sure we find a balance point between our need for security and our ability for staff to do their work. So, background, the importance of cybersecurity. So yeah, obvious stuff there, I guess, to most of us. The reason we chuck that one up, always good to do a little bit of a refresh. The obvious one there, I guess, if you've been following the news in the last few weeks at least, is that Honda incident that's happened in the last few weeks. We don't know a great deal about that particular cybersecurity incident at the moment, but interesting to perhaps talk about some of the potential things that have happened there and theorize a little bit about whether that was down to a remote worker. Who knows? Who knows at this point, I should say. So we'll talk a little bit about some common misconceptions. You're all here today, so hopefully I don't think you're impacted by this, but quite often people don't think they're a target, and really it just doesn't work like that anymore. Everybody's a target, irrespective of the size of the business, for the simple reason that ultimately the vast majority of today's focus around cybersecurity is to exploit you financially, get money from you. So, and in that sense, they're really not bothered who you are or what you do. Interesting that the position we're in now is that there are so many cyber attacks taking place these days that actually there are even specialist websites depending on the category of cyber attacks. So, for instance, there are sites out there now that specialize in just reporting incidents in the utility sector or just in the retail sector. So we've reached the point with cyber attacks now where it's become actually specialist into categories, which I think says a lot about the scale of the problem. I mentioned briefly the Honda incident there. It's likely, from what we know so far, as I said, limited, that the Honda attack was quite specific, and it looks as though they put quite a bit of effort into that attack, and therefore that's probably suggestive of a particular style of attack we see and is relatively common, unfortunately, which is people gaining access to a network and loitering on that network for an extended period, working out how they're going to maximize their attack value, and then attacking you after potentially even several months of lingering on your network. So that's the initial context we're working in. Okay, so let's talk about threats. What are the threats we're dealing with today? So I said in terms of remote workers, I guess a little bit we can talk some specifics here. I've got the classics at the start, and because it is an important one, although obviously isn't just down to remote workers, but perhaps is made a little bit worse or heightened as a risk for remote work with a remote workforce in place, but identity theft. We'll talk in more detail about this later, but identity is the crucial part of your network. If you stop and think about networks and applications and systems, it's impossible to really do anything on a modern network, Microsoft network especially, but others as well, without knowing who the user is. Everything has a context. Who is the user? What are they trying to do? So identity really does form the core of it. And I guess speaking about those remote workers, we've got those concepts of VPNs. VPNs are always the big risk. A lot more VPN uses as you would expect today. Personally, we're kind of advocates of moving away from VPNs. There are now a whole range of technologies, again, which we'll talk about later through the Microsoft 365 stack, that will allow us to deliver our solutions and applications and data to our users without the need for a VPN, and VPNs can be considered quite a weak point. If you still need the VPN, quick note, it is worth noting that if you use the Microsoft 365 multi-factor authentication solution, which again we'll have a little bit of a chat about later, there is actually a free integration for that into VPN stack, so that you can add MFA into your VPN networks and get some solid security added to it. We've obviously got networks on the list there. I mentioned those because you probably thought about your network in a certain way prior to our large-scale move to remote working. These days, you've probably got staff who, a few months ago, were not working at home very often, and if they did, they're now working on networks where the Wi-Fi they're sharing probably with their children, who are running on their home PCs, and they've got Minecraft and Roblox and all those other things running on those PCs next door, and therefore much more likely to be vulnerable to exploit and attack, jumping straight over the wireless and potentially onto your corporate machines. So the network, in terms of how we think about it, is changing. And so they're not really contained in the way that they used to be. And the same goes for apps and users. We talked about getting access to data remotely and wherever you are. And that's the way we have to work today. And then lastly, a quick mention of shadow IT. I'm sure we've all experienced it in some format, but again, that home workforce are probably experiencing extra pressures around perhaps solutions they don't have access to, or maybe it's not working the way they thought. And so it becomes quite tempting or easy for them to fall into using a solution they know at home, or they've had access to in a consumer context that isn't appropriate for corporate. And therefore, there's a real risk of shadow IT enhancing your security risk. The classic being a Dropbox scenario, of course. So that's our threats. Moving on to our users. What do our users want from us in these sort of scenarios? Well, of course, they want a lovely experience, and quite rightly so. So they want a seamless sign-in, and they don't want that to be complex or overly arduous. They want to be able to do that from anywhere, ideally. Obviously, a little bit restricted at the moment, and I'm sure they really would like it to be anywhere. But obviously, in the context of anywhere, we're talking about home, we're talking about out and about. They'd ideally like it from any device. Again, I'm sure we've all seen challenges. The laptop supply market was hit initially when COVID started, and therefore there are probably users, you had a range of users yourself who perhaps didn't have access to laptops. Maybe there were internal conversations about, can we let them use their own machines? Can they use the ones at home they've already got? Can they use their iPads? This kind of conversation. But ideally, the users would like to be able to use any device that was convenient to them at the time. Microsoft 365 can help you address a lot of these challenges right out of the box, all included in the licensing. So we've got some good solutions we can talk about in a bit. And then obviously we've talked already about applications. Users want access to everything. Generally speaking, we think about applications and data falling into kind of just a few limited camps, really high level camps. So we're talking about our standard file data. We're talking about SaaS applications, good example perhaps being Salesforce, something like that. And then we've probably got two classifications of legacy on-premise apps. So we've got our web apps on-premise, perhaps you've developed yourself, or perhaps you've got a third-party solution you're running on-premise but is delivered via web. And then perhaps you've got a full UI app, the old thick apps that you run on your corporate networks. And again, perhaps a good example of that might be a finance application. The users want access to all of those things, and they don't really matter to them that they're doing that from a home location or anywhere else. So those are the things we've got to bring to the table. How did we used to do it? So a quick run around. Some of you may recognize this, perhaps you still do pieces of it. So the old model really is the old, perhaps castle and moat, how it's referred to previously, perimeter security model. Cram everything into a corporate network, try and put some big wrappers around it, firewalls, maybe some IPS technology, and just basically let's lock everything in and protect ourselves. And then the VPN that we were talking about earlier, acting as a drawbridge to get across that corporate perimeter and get inside and get access to the network. those are not the style of networks many of us work in anymore. The cloud world has accelerated a move away from that model. A lot of those resources are now obviously already in cloud or moving to cloud, even those that are the legacy ones. So that style of approach doesn't really necessarily fit with a modern setup. And in terms of the exploits that brings to the table, it means that, again, those old VPNs usually get inside, and once you got inside, you were at increased risk of them being able to laterally move around the network, explore the network. They can decide what they can find and what's of value to them, and then run ahead and do the exploit. There's actually a post by Microsoft. We're going to put some links at the end of today's talk. Microsoft just put out an article, I think literally in the last 24, 48 hours, where they went into some quite specific detail about some security breach they've discovered recently, and it goes into quite some detail about how they literally stepped their way up from an end user's machine, user credentials, moved their way up to an admin, moved across the network, moved on to a remote machine that had a remote desktop, then they got onto another machine that didn't have a remote desktop using PowerShell, and Microsoft very carefully walk you through the sequence. It's quite, in some senses, terrifying reading, but also some very good examples of the kinds of things that attackers are doing today. So that's how we did do it. How are we going to do it? Well, hopefully this is one option on the table. It's not the only option, clearly, but Microsoft and Microsoft 365 certainly are advocates of this approach, and therefore I think worthy of consideration. Perhaps you've heard the terminology before. It's not something specific to Microsoft. It has actually been around a few years. What's really changed in the last few years is that we now have both the technology and the capability to deploy what is called a zero trust networking model. And the concept's quite simple, really. So as I said to you earlier about identities, you can extend that thinking out a little bit. And essentially, with a zero trust networking model, we don't really care about boundaries and things, because every single time a user goes to do something from an IT work perspective, we ask 4 critical questions. We identify who the user is. We identify what location they're in. By location, I mean that could be, a home network. It could be in the UK. It could be outside the UK. We identify the location in some fashion. We identify what device they're using. Are they using a corporate laptop? Are they using a BYOD laptop? Are they using an iPad? Or lastly, we identify what application or data are they trying to access. Now, if we can answer those 4 questions, each and every time they want to do something, we can then make a judgment call on what is our appetite for risk. So example 1 being, if it's on a corporate device that's compliant up to the hill, we know it's running BitLocker, etc. It's got encryption on it, it's got MFA on it, they're running it at home, and we recognize that network, and they want to access our corporate CRM system, we're comfortable with that risk, we're going to let them in. If they're on their granny's iPad, and they're on that same home network, our risk appetite is much lower. We have control of that iPad. We don't want them accessing corporate CRM systems, so we'll block access on the iPad. So if we can do that for every single access a user needs to make on the network, we can clearly have a far higher degree of control over access to our data and systems than we can with traditional perimeter networks. So that's the core of a zero trust networking approach. There are a few steps beyond that. There are things like we always assume there's breach. So part of the thinking behind a zero trust approach is that you assume your network in some fashion has been breached, and therefore you take additional steps to how you're going to capture, track, and deal with that breach when it happens. So that might involve a variety of techniques, but again, Microsoft 365 brings that to the table. So moving on, what are those risks? So we talked a little bit about identity, and obviously the throw on everyone's going to be familiar with is phishing attacks, almost certainly by far the most popular common attack today. And obviously it's a starter. Anybody phishing your credentials, that's the start of their exercise to try and get access to your data and systems. That's not the end game. It's possible they might just use it to try and send a little bit of email pretending to be you, but in reality they're probably just trying to get credentials so they can do something else. A quick example about phishing and the scale of that runs at today. So I have one particular client, we have a client it's a global client of ours, and they run at about somewhere in the region of 700 staff globally. And in the month of May, they had somewhere around 25,000, 26,000 emails actively blocked as identified as phishing attacks. Now, on top of that 26,000 phishing emails that were stopped in May, there were actually, we identified 5 actual emails that got through that filtering system, got into the end user, and those are the ones we identified. So again, perhaps another example of part of that defense in depth style approach you have to take today, which is, not only assume breach, but stuff is going to get through. You've got to try and protect yourself as much as you can, but you can't do it with a single layer. So although these solutions are very good and very powerful, none of them are magic bullets, silver bullets, so there are going to be issues. So those 5 or 6 emails that got through, in this particular case, there are other solutions we have in play with Microsoft 365 around MCAS and web filtering, pieces like that. We're able to detect when the user is potentially connected, hopefully perhaps trying to set them a second time, and then failing all that, we've even dealt with it via MFA finally, so that the password is not such a weakness anymore. Lastly, data loss. So yeah, this takes all kinds of forms. It's a big overarching term, but obviously that could be everything from your remote worker downloading something to the machine because they want to take it off and go sit in the front room and read it slowly. Perhaps they put it on a key. Perhaps they try and copy it to a USB key to put it onto the home machine, which has got the home printer attached to it. The list of scenarios is probably almost endless, to be honest with you. Some of it be unintentional, some of it could be malicious, but data loss is something we do need to think about in these scenarios. Okay, so a little wrap up for this section. Balance, it's all about balance. So yes, we can do a huge amount to secure your network with Microsoft 365, taking a more modern approach to security. We have to balance that with making sure the user experience isn't too interrupted, because we need them to be productive and able to function without constantly bothering IT or being otherwise slowed down in their ability to do work. We need those tight security controls. So we've got to be able to get ourselves into a place where we can feel comfortable that we're happy with the risk we're taking. And obviously, a bit like the data and the other questions, we need our users to be able to work no matter what kind of application or data set they're trying to use. So that's the end of the first section here. We're going to move on now to actually talk about Microsoft 365 specifically and how perhaps we can tackle some of these challenges we've just talked about. Say fairly brisk tour today. I'm just going to take a quick drink here. Excuse me. Fairly brisk tour today, so let's move through and talk about Microsoft 365. You probably all know what it is, but I'll just take one slide to quickly refresh you just in case you're not. So Microsoft 365 is, and Microsoft will probably shoot me for saying this, it's a bit of a licensing wrap really for several of their independent products. It's a little bit more than that in fairness to them, but this is a nice clean way to think about it. Office 365 you're obviously all familiar with. It also brings Windows 10 subscription licensing to the table, and that brings some handy features at a couple of different levels. We are going to talk about a little bit about different licenses within Microsoft 365 as we go through this second section. And then lastly, we've got EMS and security, which obviously probably is a good chunk of today's conversation pieces are going to come out of here. So that's where pieces like Intune, conditional access, and some of these actual security solutions we're going to talk about now come from. So that's Microsoft 365. The bulk of today's conversation is going to be about something called Microsoft 365 E3. We are going to talk a second section a little bit about something called the E5 security bolt-on. Usual Microsoft confusing terminology. The E5 security bolt-on is an add-on to E3. It is not an E5 license in the sense that you're upping yourself to a full E5. It's a stepping stone if you really want to get your users up to the full E5. I would argue you certainly don't need to do that from a security perspective. So let's look at the actual technology now. So I said at the start about the criticality of identity, and really, we're going to talk about on this section for this slide for a fair bit now. Identity really is crucial. As I say, if you think about the fact that a username and password allows you to gain access to almost anything, and also even if a basic user, a Windows user is compromised, their username and password is compromised, which is common for a variety of reasons, they can get onto your network. It's unbelievably so, for what I'm about to say, actually, trivial for an attacker to take a standard set of user credentials and elevate themselves to administrator privileges. It's far easier than you probably think it is, that's for sure. And therefore, obviously, it doesn't take an awful lot for somebody who's compromised the basic set of user credentials to start thinking about moving themselves up and around your network. So how do we deal with this with Microsoft 365? So there's a couple of key elements here. MFA is going to be the 90% solution to a lot of your issues. It takes away all the weakness from that password. It does have some other dependencies, so we're going to also talk about conditional access, and we need conditional access and some pieces in there as well. But, excuse me, at its core, if you have MFA switched on and enabled for all of your users, that is going to deal with 90% of your, or certainly your cloud-based security issues, and will help with your non-cloud-based security issues as well. The conditional access piece, I don't know how many of you are familiar with conditional access. It's a part of the, obviously, licensing suite. It is really the way I tend to describe, this is the engine that drives that zero trust networking model. So conditional access is the place where we get to build rules and say, okay, so if the user is this person, and if they're on this device, and if they want access to this, this is the criteria we're going to apply. Conditional access is the engine that allows you to build those rules up. And it's quite an intuitive process, to be fair. So again, a lot of these solutions now, they're all been built to be relatively straightforward to implement and not necessarily the huge challenges of old. I mentioned MFA's got some conditions around it. It certainly has. Probably the biggest one, if you're not familiar with it, is something called legacy authentication. So a lot of the older parts of the internet that are still in use today in some places, hopefully less and less, and that includes email, unfortunately. Some of the old email style protocols, SMTP, POP3, things you're probably familiar with, they don't have any concept of MFA. Therefore, you're even with MFA, you're potentially at risk. Conditional access actually allows us to block legacy auth. So we can block legacy authentication, we can shut those types of authentications out, and that means that even if a user's username and password is compromised, we're not exposing ourselves to any greater risk in terms of systems being compromised via old protocols. So those are key components in terms of maximizing your value for M365. And again, for those remote users, we can obviously really focus those rules down to determine what we want remote users to be able to do. Single sign-on, undervalued piece of the Microsoft 365 and Azure AD stack. One of your additional weaknesses is going to be that if you've got multiple systems out there in the cloud, and again, jump to examples, we perhaps mentioned things like Salesforce, SAP, solutions like this. You don't want your users to be able to building up yet another username and password to log into those systems. Microsoft 365, Azure AD, we can use the same engines to authenticate into those third-party tool sets. So there are a set of open standards, terms like SAML, OAuth. These are open standards, they're not Microsoft things. All the players out in the cloud market play with those, and we can then effectively change your authentication into something like Salesforce to say use Azure AD instead. Great, one username and password less to use, but obviously the huge benefit that brings to the table is that now all the rules that we built in conditional access now apply to Salesforce. So even though our third-party apps have nothing to do with Microsoft 365 or our core cloud stack, if we've got a rule that says nobody's allowed to sign in from outside the UK, then we can apply that rule to Salesforce as much as we can our own solutions and Microsoft's productivity stacks. That's very, very valuable. Huge uptake for that when we get to talk to customers about it. Moving forward in the future, we're not too far off of this now, really. There is the option to go passwordless with Microsoft 365. Certainly Microsoft's core solutions now are starting to support this extensively. And that means that truly you just don't have to bother with the password anymore. There's actually a few different pieces that come into play here. So there's a technology or standard, rather I should say, called FIDO2. There's a piece of technology you may or may not heard of from Microsoft called Windows Hello for Business, which forms part of what you get with that Microsoft 365 stack. And if you can deploy those things, you can move to a position where, for example, use myself as a reference here, using a Dell laptop with a biometric fingerprint sensor built into them, which a lot of laptops come with these days, obviously, either that or face recognition. I cannot remember the last time I typed my password to log into Windows or access any of my Office applications. It's extremely infrequent and not common. Now, in addition to not having to type that password, without getting too deep into the weeds on how all of that is structured, there's a lot of technical stuff under the hood in terms of TPM and various other bits that take place, but it also means that that is actually fully two-factor. So without being necessarily challenged for a code all the time, as you might have experienced with multi-factor in the past, that biometric sign-in is going to be a truly secure sign-in to the cloud applications. One of the little things Microsoft don't like to talk about too much, but it is worth mentioning, is that MFA is extremely powerful. It will be the single biggest security step up you can make if you don't have it today. But worth knowing that it is actually subject to attack already. It has known weaknesses. There's a particular style of attack called a man-in-the-middle attack, which we know that Azure AD is subject to, and it could be compromised. Now, if you use Windows Hello for Business on your network, again, your Microsoft 365 licensing allows you to do that. Then Windows Hello for Business is what we call a FIDO2 certified endpoint, and that means that it's no longer subject to that man-in-the-middle attack. So again, that Microsoft 365 licensing stack is a great solution for providing you security across the board. And again, specifically referencing those remote users where they just want to be able to authenticate seamlessly and get access to resources without having to get too deep into the weeds of the security it actually requires. I also mentioned, I threw in there OAuth, I think, as I was talking. I don't know if you're familiar with OAuth. It's another one of those open standards. I'm specifically mentioning it to you today because, again, I don't know how Microsoft would describe it, but I know how I would describe it. A little bit of an oversight by Microsoft, perhaps, when they originally set these things up. Your users out of the box, depending on when you had your Office 365 tenancy, Microsoft 365 tenancy originally set up, will have been able to authorize OAuth applications themselves by default. So what does that mean? What that means is that if your staff were to go to a third-party site and that solution offers the ability to integrate via OAuth, they might have been able to click an icon and the icon would have thrown a message up on screen and it would have said, that's great, you'd like to sign in with your Microsoft credentials, I can sort that for you. In order to do that, I need your permission to access your information. Are you okay with that? And they would have been able to click the OK button and that's it. That application has just been given access to that user's data in your cloud tenancy. Now, that's all fine, but that's obviously clearly a thing that most organizations want control of themselves. They don't want their end users deciding which apps should be authorized to access that information. And it's become a surprisingly common attack vector for third-party applications to connect in malicious ones, pretend to be legitimate applications and sites, get the user to acknowledge, and then, boom, they've got access to the user's information. And then they use that further to try and do a bit more reconnaissance and step up from there. That's now no longer the default. It is turned off, but they haven't retrospectively done it. So for those of you that have had your tenancies around a while, if you're not, excuse me, if you're not familiar with the OAuth issue, I would say, try and get your teams to go and look at that and get that setting dialed back. And by the way, once that's happened, you usually go in there and find that your users have authorized you at least 100 plus applications by that point, and you'll need to get somebody to go in and review all those and figure out which ones you don't want there. So yeah, good stuff on identity, lots to think about there because it is a crucial part of the story. Devices. So obviously we talked about all those. Again, we're talking about now the fact that Microsoft 365 covers you for all these bases. So we can manage Windows 10 endpoints completely via Intune. And unlike your probably existing corporate networks where you might have perhaps you're familiar with group policies and features like that, Intune actually takes it a step beyond that, because with Intune, not only can we apply those policies and configure machines, ensure BitLocker is switched on, ensure Windows Hello for Business is configured, and do those pieces we've been talking about, we can actually measure it on the far side. So we can do compliance. So we can actually say, not only do I want to switch on BitLocker, but I want you to separately assess whether BitLocker has been successfully enabled. And that's crucial because it's that compliance side that we're then going to use for the conditional access rules to say, is this machine compliant? I don't just want to know that it's a corporate machine. I want to know that it's a corporate machine that has BitLocker enabled, has up-to-date antivirus on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Intune is a big part of securing that, the device side of things. On mobile phones, tablets, we've got a couple of approaches, all this stuff natively built in. So we can take two approaches with those. We can either go full mobile device management. So that's the full configuration of the device that usually applies to corporately owned assets. We can define, what PIN codes, what encryption. We can define what applications are installed. You get complete control of the device as much as it was a Windows 10 device. Or you've got that option to go MAM, mobile application management. So in that remote workforce scenario, this is perhaps one of those ones that kicks in because perhaps you don't mind them using Granny's iPad to access Outlook, but you want to enforce the Outlook on the iPad, even though it's not your corporate iPad, the Outlook application and its data is encrypted. And not only is it encrypted on that device, but you also then have the permission to delete that little pocket of data should you choose to in future. So mobile application management allows you to drill down to that level of specifics, and that's something that's available to all of you for device management in Intune and Microsoft 365. So obviously I've talked already about integrating with conditional access, and I've mentioned how basically this compliance side of these tools via Intune, not just configuration, but also compliance, allow us to run that in with conditional access and drive out security for that remote workforce. And then lastly, I'll just quickly mention, perhaps those of you, perhaps larger organizations are attending today, perhaps you have SCCM. I'm sure your team's already aware, but I just mentioned it briefly. If you have a heavy investment in those already, it's perfectly possible right now with the licensing you have between Microsoft 365 and SCCM to just hook the two into each other. And you can then use something called Microsoft Endpoint Manager, which is kind of a collective solution between SCCM and Intune. And those cloud tools, and allows you to extend that power all the way across to your on-prem and SCCM estate. So just worth mentioning quickly that that's definitely one for the large organizations if you run those tools. So application security, we talked about our users, talked about our devices, let's talk about applications. So I've already talked a bit about SAML and OAuth, so I don't tend to talk about those too much, other than to say just a quick reminder that is there. It is actually relatively quick to set these things up. To give you an example, a usual SAML integration, just the basic setup of it doesn't usually take much more than that, half an hour. Obviously, for those organizations a bit bigger, you're going to want to do testing, etc. So it is going to take longer than that. But just wanted to set a quick example. These are quick things to set up. These are not big projects you need to undertake to take advantage of them. I talked earlier about the couple of different styles of apps. So we've got those legacy web apps and perhaps those full UI apps on-premise, your finance applications. There are two tool sets built into Microsoft 365 that you have as part of the licensing that allow you to deliver those applications out from on-premises to your remote workforce today in a secure fashion. So let me give you an example. Perhaps some of you are familiar with this. You might have a web application today that you're running on-premise. And perhaps as part of mass enabling it for your workforce, what you've had to do, or you had already, was you've opened up a port in your firewall. The users are hitting the web browser and they're connecting to your web app and they're typing in their AD credentials. Absolutely fine. You've probably been using that for years and it works. However, if you were to stick an app proxy in the way, and that app proxy is a little download from Microsoft included in your license, drop that onto a machine, it will make the connection to that web application you've got built, and it will then make an outbound connection back to Microsoft Azure. And it will then act as the front gate to that application on the web. And you say, why do I want to do that? Why do I want to put an extra step in the way? A couple of reasons. One is you can shut down your firewall. Your firewall ports can be closed down. And obviously it's a lot less vulnerable if the attackers can't hit your web servers directly if they've got to go through something else. So great, I can shut down my firewall ports because all the connections are now outbound via the app proxy agent. But two, is that the front end security for all of that, the authentication, is going to be Azure AD. It's going to be that same piece we've already been talking about. So the user's going to be already authenticated because they signed into their device with it. They're not going to get challenged again. And all of the rules that you've built to apply to your conditional access, no access outside the UK, et cetera, they all just going to be inherited and default applied to your legacy web app. So it sounds trivial, but those are a couple of significant step ups on the security front that are well worth looking at if you've got legacy web apps on-prem. And then lastly, our WVD and our full UI. So full UI apps, as I said, the example I always use is those finance apps. You've almost certainly got finance teams that use a thick application to access data. Those are some of the more challenging ones that deliver out to remote users sometimes. Again, you're probably familiar with solutions like remote desktop services, etc. Those will be WVD, Windows Virtual Desktop, that's what it stands for, included in your Microsoft 365 licensing, and it's a definite part of that. It effectively is RDS in the cloud. It's Microsoft running the bulk of the RDS infrastructure on your behalf. All you need to do is run one server to act as the back end, and you can run them in groups if you need resilience or scale, and that can then run your full app. So again, there is license capability built into that Microsoft 365 solution today that's going to allow you to deal with those remote worker challenges, even with the full apps. So worth knowing about. I'm just very quickly going to mention Microsoft Information Protection. I say quickly because it's important, but we have a separate webinar that talks in this about a lot more detail if you're interested. But this is about protecting the data. This is about taking the actual files, the actual data in your systems, and instead of protecting the systems, we can put wrappers on the files themselves, and we can enforce policies on those and encrypt them, or say they can't be emailed or can't be printed, etc., etc., etc. So that Microsoft Information Protection part of that M365 suite allows us to actually wrap up the data and secure that as well. Okay, so time running out on us. I'll pick up the pace a little bit, move into this last section. We're going to talk about the Microsoft 365 E5 security add-on. So I talked about Microsoft 365 E3. Anything I talk about now is a step up. It does require this little add-on to the additional license. So you do be aware of that. So what does it bring into the table? It's bringing a variety of things, but probably 3 or 4 big ones. So the big ones we're bringing to the table are something called Azure ATP, something called MCAS, MD ATP, and Office 365 ATP. And we'll talk about each of those in a little more detail now. Office 365 ATP, just briefly mentioned, it's enhanced email scanning. You get built-in junk mail filtering in Office 365. Add Office 365 ATP, and that gets notched up another level, enhanced scanning, something called sandboxing and detonation chambers, and just very technical stuff that allows us to catch the more advanced threats as they come through email. So Office 365 ATP being one of the first parts. Azure ATP, again, back to identity. We've talked about identity being critical. Azure ATP is very advanced, machine learning based detection of identities doing things on your network that you're not expecting. So what do I mean by that? So as I said, everything on the network has to have an identity. Somebody connects into your network via VPN at 3 in the morning. It's probably not your member of staff, but how are you going to catch that? Azure ATP would catch that unquestionably, because that would be identified as anomalous behavior, and it would say, Joe's just logged in at 3 in the morning. Joe doesn't normally log in at 3 in the morning. So you probably want to take a look at that and see what's happened. You can actually take that up a level and have automated behaviors off the back, in case you're wondering. But also you could just have it alert you. Azure ATP is critical, really, because anything anybody wants to do bad on your network, they're going to do it with an identity. I've been involved in full-blown penetration tests before, and I've seen those external pen testing companies be quite pleased with themselves when they've gained access to certain parts of the network, completely unaware of the fact the second that they've stepped off their entry point into the network, I was alerted by Azure ATP that they'd just done that. And it was only because I didn't take any action off the bat that they were able to then continue their exercise. So Azure ATP is a big part of identity anomaly detection. MCAS. We talked about shadow IT, we talked about data. MCAS is a big part of Microsoft's story about monitoring that data flow in and out of your business. It definitely needs a bit of talking about in terms of enhancing web filtering, and you can mix the two. But MCAS is all about monitoring that flow in and out of your business via the web usually. So if people are dropping stuff in and out of SharePoint and OneDrive, or maybe into Dropbox, MCAS is going to be a big part of your story of catching that. So it's a very, very valuable step up. The biggest step up, I think, in my personal opinion here, to that security bolt-on is Microsoft Defender ATP. So Microsoft Defender is now considered the #1 ranked AV product. However, add on that ATP layer and you're moving into a completely different league in terms of capability. So now we can detect anomalous behavior on endpoints. And that's literally machine learning based behaviors. We can do cloud analytics. We can submit files and have them analyzed. And we have the machine take automated actions off the back of that to secure those endpoints. A lot of Microsoft's most sophisticated threat detection work takes place in MDATP. And that blog I mentioned earlier will have largely been driven by the capabilities built into MDATP. Of course, if you have this deployed, you don't need a third-party AV product. And you're a significant step up from most third-party AV products anyway. So there's an option here to trade costs and things in terms of budgets. It also includes threat and vulnerability management. So MDATP is now capable of scanning your endpoints for vulnerabilities in software on those machines. It doesn't just have to be Microsoft software. So you can see some examples on the screen there where it's detecting vulnerabilities in 7-Zip and Wireshark. So MDATP will detect these vulnerabilities on the machine, inform you that you've got an old version with vulnerabilities. And if you want, if you have the full Intune stack all hooked in, you can join those dots together and have it update the software for you on the endpoint. So overall, very powerful solution there. And then lastly, I just mentioned there's an overarching dashboard. So Microsoft have recently kind of integrated the whole suite of tools into something called Microsoft Threat Protection, and there is a threat protection dashboard. And they've taken all the independent dashboards now and started to pull it into a singular view of both the state of your network, risk, incidents, and things on it. And obviously, I talked about those OAuth apps there. You can see on the right-hand side, it's detecting that for you and giving you a nice view of that as well. So Microsoft Threat Protection, that unified dashboard, is a nice little summary way to get into all of the tools that Microsoft have for security. I'm going to talk very quickly, because I'm pretty much out of time now, about privileged identity management. So privileged identity management, I mentioned this because, again, remote workers, you've got your IT teams working remotely as well. This is about saying, I want to take my IT admin roles and I want to secure them even more than my standard roles. So what does that mean? Basically, the idea is quite simple. Microsoft have the ability with PIM to effectively say, right, nobody is an admin at all at any point in time. All of their accounts, even separate admin accounts, and I hope they're running separate admin accounts, they're not actually privileged as admins minute to minute. They only get that privilege when it's assigned by someone else, or it can be auto-assigned for a limited period if that's what you want to do. But effectively, it's the idea that anytime somebody needs access, they're granted access for a limited period. You know who did it, you know how long they did it for, they have to record why they needed it, and so you get a complete overview of all that identity, that privilege. It also means that if one of your admin accounts is compromised, they can't do anything with it. That account is not a privileged role day to day, so it doesn't allow them to do anything substantial on your cloud solutions. And with cloud solutions, everything's obviously in one place, so you need to think a little more deeply about what would happen if somebody did compromise one of those admin accounts. So, very quick summary there as I rush towards the end. Apologies for my pacing, but there we go. So we're at the end. I hope that was of use. It was a whistle-stop tour, I think, of some of the challenges and some of the solutions we can bring to the table with Microsoft 365. Hopefully that was useful. If we've got any questions, please feel free to throw those in now. We'll see what we can do to ask. As I say, we'll follow up. This is all being recorded today, so I think we'll follow up with a link to the recording. And obviously, if there's any follow-up questions any of you have that you want to take offline separately, you're welcome to do so. So with that in mind, I guess we'll see if we've got any questions. Let me see if I can just bring up the Q&A and we'll see what's popped up.
Hi, Mark. I've got one here in the question box, just around the web filtering recommendations. Do you have a web filtering recommendation to work alongside MCAS?
Yeah, so good question there. Yeah, there are a couple of what are classified as, I don't know, I guess you'd call them best of breed web filtering solutions out there. They're recognized sort of Gartner Magic Quadrant style recognition of how good the products are. The two that we tend to default towards are Zscaler and Forcepoint, and both of those products have the ability to natively integrate to differing degrees, but natively integrate with MCAS. And when you've got those two hooked in, you've got full agent-based web filtering taking place on your endpoint. So your remote workers, every bit of web filtering they're doing is going through Zscaler servers, for instance, and that is in real time talking to MCAS. So you're able to do policy enforcement if you don't want users to go to certain sites certain times a day. We're back to that whole zero trust principles. We can do that with Zscaler and Forcepoint and MCAS. Hopefully that answers that question. Have we got any other questions coming in? None that I can see at the moment.
I think that's all we've got time for. So if anyone has any other questions, the slides and recordings will be sent out after this afternoon. Feel free to reply with any questions that you have for that.
Okay, brilliant. In that case, thank you very much, everyone. I hope that was useful. Enjoy the rest of your day.